kind of blown away by the fact that of the geographic proximity of Israel to Egypt, and yet in many ways worlds apart, where Israel shared much more with its Semitic neighbors, especially in the Levant, but also Mesopotamia, as I think we shall see. The horizons of the stage on which the Old Testament is played mostly extend to this life only. Attention is focused on Israel's fidelity to Yahweh and to the blessing and consequences during one's lifespan. This observation brings to light the Old Testament's frame of reference. The eschaton in the Old Testament is not the resurrection of individual believers to an eternal afterlife in heaven, but the post-exilic restoration of later generations of corporate Israel in the land. In our study of afterlife in the Old Testament, we would be remiss to focus on a small selection of disparate passages that happen to touch on death and afterlife without first observing and respecting the fact that the Old Testament gives little attention to the subject. As I suggest, afterlife is an afterthought. The Old Testament says little about heavenly reward in the afterlife, what is often called pie in the sky. Now, most of the Old Testament shows a persistent belief in human existence beyond the grave in the underworld, usually specified as Sheol, or the pit. We're fortunate that archaeologists have uncovered the royal and priestly archives in the late Bronze city of Ugarit on the Mediterranean coast in modern-day Syria. Although not technically the land of Canaan, it does appear to represent West Semitic world of the Levant. The correspondences between the Old Testament and Ugarit regarding death in the underworld are remarkable. In Act 3 of the Baal myth, Mot, the god of the dead and the underworld, invites Baal as his guest and, ironically, as his main course, saying, "Surely you will descend into divine Mot's throat." Baal is then given these instructions: "And descend to the house of release in the underworld, be counted among those who descend to the underworld, and you will know, O God, that you are dead." Over 40 times, the law, the prophets, and the writings describe death as a descent to the pit or Sheol. Baal's death is similarly described and is remarkably similar to the poetic description of death in Psalm 88. "I am reckoned with those who descend to the pit, released," the same cognate term, "among the dead, like the slain who lie down in the grave." At Ugarit, death could also be likened to sleep. Akat's lying down in his grave is a parallel expression to his sleep. Another compelling link between the Old Testament and Ugarit is the puzzling group called the Rephaim. 8 times, the Old Testament refers to the Rephaim, often rendered shades, where the term is collocated with the dead and Sheol. At Ugarit, the Rapi Uma are the ancient dead, and most notably their deified kings who have descended into the earth and the dust. They are quite active, and thus the term likely means healthy ones or possibly healers, derived from the West Semitic root Rapha. Old Testament usage, however, likely exploiting a polemical twist, points to the root Rapha, pronounced the same, meaning those who drop, go slack, or the weak. Before proceeding, we must highlight 2 important points. First, these parallels, though we observe them as texts, were not transmitted textually by scribes. These cannot be intertextual allusions. Ugarit was destroyed by the Sea Peoples near the end of the Late Bronze period, so its library was inaccessible to the Hebrew settlers who entered the Canaanite highlands in the Iron Age. These parallels must be explained as oral tradition, or I think now more accurately, cultural memory. Second, the infelicities that Sheol has with Yahwism, as will be shown, indicate that Israel's default images of death and Sheol were not generated within Yahwism, but were a memory that Israel inherited from its common Semitic culture. The memory of the dead in the underworld that Israel inherited from its Semitic environment is part of a broader memory, which we may call the cosmic map of the geography of the universe. This graphic portrays the default worldview reflected in many Old Testament passages, most notably the priestly creation account in Genesis 1. The earth is founded upon the waters by pillars, the tops of which can be seen in the mountains. Under the earth is the underworld of Sheol. Keeping the waters and the skies above from flooding the earth is the solid metal plate of the firmament. The heavenly lamps are secured in the skies above by their installation in the firmament. The deity who established this world order was the God of the skies. The reign of this cosmic king is manifest in the rain that he dispenses for the agricultural economy of the ancient world. As king, he then has his palace or temple constructed upon his sacred mountain, Zaphon in Ugarit, Zion in Israel. In the ancient Near East, corresponding to this cosmic map of the geography of the universe, was the deity map of their respective domains. The religion of the ancient Near East can be characterized as naming the powers, whereby the forces and regions of nature were named as gods and personified. At Ugarit, El was the old patriarch of the gods, the supreme authority, the creator of creatures. Baal-Hadad was the younger, vigorous warrior known as Cloud Rider, the god of the skies. His arrows were lightning and his voice was thunder. Mot was the god of the death and the underworld. Within this Semitic cultural framework, ancient Israel's theologies, or memories of Yahweh, were formed by the processes of assimilation and dissimilation, whereby Yahweh assimilated the various job descriptions and portfolios of the deities in the ancient world, but also dissimilated himself from Baal, Moloch, and other so-called gods. Yahweh actually takes on El's name, as evident in Yisrael, Beit El, El Shaddai. He adopts Baal's role as cloud rider, god of the skies, while simultaneously dissociating himself from Baal and becoming his rival. But it would seem Israel could never bring itself to the point to ascribe Mot's role as underworld deity to Yahweh. The Old Testament never embraces Sheol as Yahweh's domain. This issue of Yahweh's domain applies not only to the cosmic and deity maps of the ancient world, but also to the physical geography map. Old Testament passages reflected in the earlier Iron Age, as here in the words of David, suggest that Yahweh's sovereignty and domain was limited to the political boundaries of Israel. But once Israel's political perspectives shift from petty states in the Levant to the Assyrian Empire in the second half of the 8th century, and later the Babylonian and Persian empires, the extent of Yahweh's estate is reevaluated and expanded, as we shall see. To be clear on the frame of reference of the Old Testament, we must recalibrate our statement of the problem. The problem is not one of life versus afterlife, mortality versus immortality, or time versus eternity. The problem for ancient Israel was one of geography. It was perceived not as an anthropological problem regarding the soul, but a theological one regarding divine domain. To my knowledge, Sheol has no genesis in the Old Testament. Yahweh never creates it. The shades are independent of Yahweh. It is notably absent from the cosmic map portrayed in the priestly account of Genesis 1. In the Yahwistic Garden of Eden account, the human life cycle is from Adamah to Adam back to Adamah, from ground to the human to the dust, or dust to dust, or what science today would call the carbon cycle. Sheol is a loose end within Israelite monotheism. Its genesis does not lie within Yahwism. I argue it is a memory inherited from its Semitic cultural environment, or more to the point, it was a nightmare incompatible with Yahwism. Now, the Old Testament frequently refers to death as a natural process with expressions such as he died, he lay down with his fathers. Only occasionally does it refer to Sheol as related terms. Sheol surfaces in laments, in the Psalms, in Jacob's laments, in the J narrative, and as a poetic image in Job and Proverbs, and in oracles against foreign nations, interestingly, in the prophets. Of particular interest is the repeated claim, as here on the PowerPoint, that the dead cannot praise Yahweh. So, to what attributes of Yahweh do these songs appeal? Which divine attributes are seen to be at odds with the notion of Sheol? In each of these passages, Yahweh's loyalty, or hesed, and fidelity, emet, are spotlighted. Sheol seems incompatible with these values of Yahweh. We can make more sense of the song language once we hear the Psalms imaginatively in the visual spaces of the temple, where many of the songs were performed. The underworld forms the antithesis of the Temple Mount, as I suggest here in these pair of opposites. Then in the late 7th century, King Josiah and the prophet Jeremiah discredited the ritual practice of making one's child, quote, pass through the fire to Moloch, an underworld deity, in the Valley of Hinnom. Henceforth, the Valley of Hinnom became associated with fire, the underworld, and a place of burial for the dead. So the language of the Psalms echoes the geographic symbolism of the temple on Mount Zion and its proximity to the Valley of Hinnom, or as it is better known, Gehenna. So standing on the Temple Mount, you can get a hell of a view. The popular conceptions of death and afterlife in Sheol formed a memory that Israel inherited within their Semitic culture. Death for the Israelites, as for all humanity, was the great unknown. But their problem was compounded because death and Sheol seemed incompatible with Yahwism. In what follows, we shall see that the biblical writers address this problem by applying to this great unknown what they knew of Yahweh from their collective memories. In short, they believe that Yahweh, who has shown himself to be faithful, will somehow transcend death in a way yet to be disclosed. What I see operating here is what I would call reasoned revelation. That is, revelation by inference and analogy, a kind of ancient empirical process based on experience. They reason, for example, as Yahweh has been our Savior and Redeemer, especially from Egypt, then He can and must redeem us from Sheol. So the first proposed solution here in Israel's early poetry. Many scholars believe that the earliest literature contained in the Hebrew Bible can be found in some archaic poems. Among them, the so-called Song of Moses, Deuteronomy 32, and the Song of Hannah, 1 Sam chapter 2. Both of these songs predicate actions of Yahweh that assert divine powers in opposite pairs. Chief among them is His power to, quote, bring to life after putting to death. They assert Yahweh's capacity to do so, but do not provide testimony that He has actually done so. To be clear, these early poems do not treat afterlife as an independent subject. Yahweh is the principal subject. The Song of Moses asserts His incomparability, and the Song of Hannah His power to effect social reversals. Second model that Israel uses. When facing the inevitability of death, two psalms uniquely claim Yahweh as the worshiper's portion. Namely 16, Yahweh is the allotment of my portion, my heritage, my inheritance. God is the rock of my heart and my portion. But elsewhere in the Old Testament, this claim is exclusive to the Levites and the Aaronic priests. Psalm 16 goes on to claim, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, you will not allow your faithful one to see the pit." Now, one could argue that given the majority view among the Psalms, that verse 10 simply refers to the avoidance of premature death, and verse 11 to the joy of temple worship. Even so, we shall see that this is a passage susceptible to later reinterpretation, as in Psalm 73. So here, at the moment of the failure of his own body, the worshiper claims Yahweh as his portion and the enduring rock of his heart. The logic appears to be that although I am mortal, my inheritance and relationship with Yahweh will endure. The interpretive crux lies in how we interpret little long, eternity, forever, or simply to remote time, and achar, after what? Both psalms are ambiguous, and to this question we shall return. A third model that ancient Israel used, Psalms 7 and 17 are suggestive of a cultic rite of incubation, a night vigil, for those accused of a crime, where in the absence of clear evidence, a petitioner appeals to the Supreme Court of Yahweh. During a night at the temple, Yahweh assays his heart, and if he survives the night, he will awake and behold Yahweh's face. While this likely refers to God's vindication of the innocent, this image of awaking in God's presence will become ripe for reapplication in the post-exilic period. Fourth memory of Yahweh. We now arrive at the prophetic books of Amos and Hosea, both of whose ministries correlate with Tiglath-Pileser's reshaping Assyria from a localized kingdom to an empire spanning the Fertile Crescent, just when Israel and Judah are about to lose their political independence. At such a moment, the extent of Yahweh's sovereignty becomes crucial. Will he be overshadowed by Ashur, the patron god of Assyria, and later by Marduk, the patron god of Babylon? Both of these prophets address the northern kingdom of Israel, and both repeatedly appeal to the memory of the Exodus, when Yahweh brought his people up from Egypt. Given the precedent of Yahweh's power over Egypt, one could reason that he could overpower the superpowers of Assyria and Babylon. These prophets chart out Yahweh's power not only on the geopolitical map, but also the cosmic map. In a judgment oracle in Amos 9, Yahweh highlights his inescapable judgment on Israel, and it begins with his cosmic reach. If they dig into Sheol, from there my hand will take them. Lakach. Once again, the issue is not afterlife per se, but the extent of Yahweh's reach and capacity. In another judgment oracle, here in Hosea, that highlights the certainty and extent of Yahweh's judgment on Israel, Hosea affirms Israel's death sentence. Yahweh seems to raise the possibility of redeeming the Israelite, only to say this will not happen. From the hand of Sheol should I ransom them, from death should I redeem them, and the conclusion of the verse, compassion is hidden from my eyes. Once again, this is not a claim that Yahweh characteristically redeems humans from Sheol, but simply that he has the capacity to do so. The verb choice of redeem, ransom, implies that Sheol marks the extent of Yahweh's reach, but not his cosmic domain as such. In chapter 6, Hosea mimics the Liturgy of Repentance, which includes a series of reversals that echo the earlier Song of Moses. Now, in this passage, we must be clear that this action of revival occurs after wounding, not putting to death. And it applies to corporate restoration, not individual resurrection. But again, this pre-exilic oracle could be reinterpreted later in the post-exilic period. Psalm 49, interestingly, uses the same verbs found in the pre-exilic prophets of Hosea and Amos. But God will ransom Hadah, my soul, from the hand of Sheol. He will take Lakach me. Most view this as a late psalm, though we can't be certain or precise. The petitioner's chief concern is those who trick him and trust in their wealth. But even they could not pay the ransom, so they could live forever and never see the pit. Indeed, graves are their home forever, and like sheep they are appointed to Sheol. Given the petitioner's contrasting identity, as he claims here, it seems unavoidable to read this claim as God's deliverance from Sheol after death, not merely a deliverance from a premature death. So this may be our first clear reference in the Old Testament to deliverance out of Sheol and to an afterlife with God. Fifth Israelite tradition. The clearest reference to resurrection as an intervention of God is Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones. The problem for these bones is not that they lie in Sheol, but that they lack flesh and breath. Fortunate for Ezekiel, a priest, Yahweh does not require him to lay his hands on the bones, but simply to prophesy twice, after which, quote, they lived and stood on their feet. In the closing verses interpreting this vision, 11:14, Yahweh clarifies these bones are the whole house of Israel, making clear this portrays corporate resurrection. And the promise, quote, I will bring you out of the ground to the ground of Israel, clarifies that this vision is an image of Israel's post-exilic restoration to the land, not a promise of actual resurrection. No passages of the Bible have been more hotly contested than the so-called servant songs found in Isaiah. In the narrative sequence of the fourth song, the servant is described as, quote, cut off from the land of the living. He is given, quote, his grave in his death, and his life is described as a guilt offering. That he will subsequently, quote, see his seed, prolong his days, and see light, following the reading of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yahweh will then allot him spoil. Whether this servant was understood originally as an individual or corporate group, whether or not he was actually dead, buried, and raised, need not deter us now, but our ultimate interest is how this passage is subsequently reinterpreted in the later post-exilic period. Sixthly, the priests. I'm not an expert in priestly materials and traditions in the Hebrew Bible, but they appear to say little, if anything, about an afterlife. The book of Leviticus exhibits a priestly preoccupation with ritual purification, which is most often occasioned by the flow of blood, female menstrual fluids, or male semen, all of which signified loss of life and thus potentially death. Contact with a corpse also brought impurity. In ritual sacrifice, the separation of blood and fat symbolized dead. We should also note that Leviticus singles out the forbidden worship of Moloch among all gods, a deity of the dead in the underworld. These efforts likely reflect the priest's zeal to ban the so-called cult of the dead or ancestor worship. A consequence of these efforts, however, was to dissociate Yahweh from the dead in ancient Israel. I would suggest, therefore, that in effect, the priests suppressed affirmations and hopes for an afterlife with Yahweh. Their influence in shaping the Hebrew Bible was considerable, as evident in P. the redaction of the Pentateuch, Ezekiel, Ezra, and Chronicles. There is one instance, however, where the priestly writers may have inadvertently provided hope for an afterlife with God. The priestly genealogy in Genesis 5 appears to mimic the Sumerian king list, where each highlights the seventh in the list who ascends to the gods. The seventh in Genesis 5 is, of course, Enoch. Now, the point of the priestly genealogy is to highlight the figure of Enoch, but his verb choice took, or lakach, after the Hebrew Scriptures are formed, invited a reinterpretation of the same verb found in our two key passages found in the Psalms. So God can indeed take or snatch his devoted one from death and Sheol. Finally, last year, apocalyptic traditions. Apocalypses are some of the latest materials in the Old Testament. Most scholars date Isaiah's little apocalypse, Isaiah 24:7, to the 5th century BCE. Two verses are key. He will swallow up death forever. Now here, Yahweh's devouring of death is strangely reminiscent of Mot's devouring Baal in the Ugaritic library. The second passage, 26, your dead shall live, their corpses shall arise, awake and shout for joy, O dwellers in the dust. And the earth, or we could also translate Eretz as underworld, shall give birth to, or literally let drop, the Rephaim. Although this passage is often hailed as one of the clearest references to resurrection in the Old Testament, we must be struck that no action is predicated of Yahweh. He does not intervene or resurrect. Instead, afterlife is depicted as a waking from sleep. In effect, afterlife becomes possible because death is reduced to a form of sleep from which awaking is a natural process, as are dew and light in the morning. The second image of afterlife is even more bizarre. The language is another natural process. Mother Earth literally lets her baby drop from the womb. Moreover, her baby is identified as the Rephaim, the ancient mythological identifier for the shades of the dead. So we now come full circle. The mythological memory that Israel inherited from its ancient Semitic culture was the nightmare for Yahwism. But this passage that tries to banish the nightmare is strangely framed in mythological terms, not in terms that are characteristic of Yahwism. It appeals to imagination, not logic and evidence, to overcome the nightmare. Like Daniel 7, this late biblical apocalyptic passage illustrates how ancient memories survive over centuries and among diverse people groups. These echoes can be explained only in terms of cultural memories, not on the basis of genetic textual links. Again, the late Bronze Library of Gart was buried long before the emergence of ancient Israel's canonical library, yet these memories are evidenced here in the Hellenistic period. Arguably, the clearest passage of resurrection is the 2nd century apocalypse of Daniel 12, as I have up here. This is our first passage to address the problem of Yahweh's justice by distinguishing the destinies of the righteous and those deserving judgment. Prior to this, in the Psalms, the issue was simply Yahweh's faithfulness to his devotees. Unlike previous passages we have examined, this one appears to be textually derived from other passages in the Hebrew Bible. First, from our previous apocalyptic passage. So Daniel borrowing from Isaiah's apocalypse, the image of awaking from the dust. Once again, we note this Daniel 12 passage does not describe resurrection as an act of God, but simply as awaking from sleep in the dust. The only echoes we have within Yahwism of awaking from sleeping lie in our Psalms. These apocalyptic passages have no clear intertextual flags to Psalm 17, but this is problematic only if we think in terms of texts and the exegesis of written scriptures. In 1953, Harold Ginsburg argued that, quote, the oldest interpretation of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 was this passage here in Daniel, which also draws from other texts in the Hebrew Bible. And here I show the intertextual links. So if Daniel 12 is in fact the oldest interpretation of the suffering servant, it clearly offers a corporate interpretation and identifies my servant as the enlighteners, the masculine of the Second Temple period. While we might debate whether or not Isaiah's suffering servant experienced the light of resurrection, it's clear that Daniel's enlighteners must be counted among the many, quote, who were, quote, sleeping in the ground of the dust, but awoke to everlasting life. So here I offer my conclusions. This paper has been one more of an inductive study than a deductive one. It did not begin with a theory of memory and a model of memory study, of which I am clearly a novice. It began as an attempt to interpret the Old Testament data regarding death and afterlife. But it now concludes that memory studies may be a more accurate descriptor than tradition history for the phenomena and processes operating in Israelite religion and the Hebrew Bible. Off the record, as a friend and colleague of Tom Attina's, you have no idea how difficult it is for me to admit that I have learned something from Tom. I was blind, but now I see. Tradition history criticism studies the traditum, the content of the tradition, and the traditio, the transmission process of the tradition. Now, this form of biblical criticism has made considerable contributions to our understandings of the Old Testament and Israelite religion, but practitioners may construe tradition as an object, and its transmission as an objective process whereby received traditions are consciously analyzed and sifted. But the term memory includes both the objective and subjective, the external and internal dimensions of remembering what we've learned. Memory studies are more cognizant that the memories we receive individually and collectively are often simply received from our forebears and not scrutinized for logical consistency and coherence, as in the learning of language. Imagination may prove more compelling than logic and facts. Tradition history and form criticism began, in part, as a healthy reaction to literary criticism, and are thus certainly aware of oral tradition. But in practice, these tools still tend to focus on texts. Now, as scholars, century removed from ancient Israel, we have no other choice but to study their religion and society through the texts they have left us. But while this may be our means of studying their memories and beliefs, this does not entail that their beliefs were shaped solely by texts and scribes. We must view the texts we study as surviving monuments of their beliefs, which they happen to embed in these texts. As frozen traditions, they could easily thaw them out and shape them imaginatively in their minds, and orally in informal conversations, and informal liturgies and rituals. Biblical studies is like archaeology. Archaeologists discover structures, artifacts, and even texts by accident, and by what happens to survive. They can study beliefs only insofar as they can be inferred from material remains. Biblical scholars study the traditions and beliefs that happen to have been inscribed by interested parties, usually the elites in society, but much has been lost and can only be hypothesized. I believe memory studies can benefit research into death and afterlife in the Old Testament most clearly on 3 points. First, Israel's default conception of death in the underworld of Sheol is a memory inherited from their Semitic culture, not a tradition generated within Yahwism. Second, the various counter-memories, such as I have listed here, are manifest not as texts connected exegetically, but as key terms and metaphoric images associated imaginatively. There is no exegetical argument presented. The process is best understood as an imaginative one than an analytical one. It is more right brain than left brain. In short, it is best described as a function of memory, not as an assessment of written traditions. Third, particularly noteworthy in this list is the persistence of mythological motifs from the late Bronze period to the Hellenistic period within Yahwism. The personification of the death, the Rephaim, the underworld, and so on. Given that Yahwism was often at odds with Canaanite beliefs, especially those associated with Baal, these artifacts are better explained as cultural memories than traditions passed from generation to generation.
I'm intrigued by you opened by saying how interested you were in the fact that Egypt and Israel are so close to each other, and yet Israel went so its own way. And then I heard pass through the fire and assay the heart and redeem, which I heard in the first paper and wondered is, I take your point that Sheol is Ugaritic as opposed to Yahwistic. Are those features also Ugaritic?
I mean, like I say, what we happen to have from Ugaritic, we happen to discover the priestly and the royal archives. I'm more familiar with the religious literature, and I don't recall references to judgment in the afterlife. In Ugaritic, you simply, as Baal, you go into the underworld. Yeah, I think the assaying of metallurgy is perhaps as close as you can get. But again, I suppose in ancient Israel, I would see that more as an adoption of a commercial image applied to Yahweh, but not a fully developed notion of afterlife judgment.
But even just the saying of the heart as being associated with what comes next, I found
right.
I felt
Right. Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, the Psalms are largely temple texts, so it's not surprising to say that judgment is perceived to take place at temple entry. So I see in the Psalms various temple entry liturgies. We're entering on hallowed ground here. Wow, this could be dangerous. And so God weighs the heart to see whether or not you can enter a temple, but not anything eschatological. But of course, you're not far from applying that kind of spatial imagery of sacred space at the temple to heavenly space in the afterlife. But I don't see that operating in the Old Testament as such. Thank you.
Tobias?
Thank you very much. I have a dozen of questions, but I will ask only one. I like the term reasoned revelation.
Oh.
Quite a lot.
That came to me late in the night, so there's something to that.
But in how far does in this kind of process which you have shown about memories, being in new constellations and so on, also the point of shock and crisis play a role? I would at least see the crisis also of the exile as something which is very, very important to reshape memories, and in the Danielic text, the crisis of the 2nd century, also something which creates an impulse or that we have to reshape this kind of clusters of
right. No, you're absolutely right. I was thinking of highlighting that more particularly, but yeah, so the three major empires, so when Assyria comes in the 8th century, Israel and Judah are about to lose their political independence, and that prompts prophets like Hosea and Amos to rethink Yahweh's sovereignty, which impinges in part on Sheol and afterlife. And then you're right, exile, Babylonian exile is another crisis, and then the Hellenistic crisis in the 2nd century. That is very operative to prompt Israel to reevaluate their traditions. But what I find quite striking is that what seems to be happening to Israel and Judah politically and socially is very much a downward trend where they are subjugated, and yet ironically their theology magnifies many times over, where the patron deity of this petty province of Hebrew becomes the sovereign God in the book of Daniel, particularly. So yeah, crisis is indeed upon. Christian?
I liked your idea of counter memory very much. It was quite impressive. Just a remark from the theory of memory. Alida Assmann has developed the term of negative memory in the last few years. Maybe it would be useful to look at that if it can cover what you found in the Old Testament. I don't know whether you know it or not.
No, I don't. I mean, it's an interesting concept. Negative in what sense?
In the sense of something that has to be avoided by the memory group at all costs.
Right.
It's in the context of the Germans, their memory and Holocaust.
Okay.
So it's, maybe that might be a trace you could follow or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when you say that, I immediately think of another example. It doesn't apply to afterlife and death, but in terms of the origins or homeland of Yahweh, you look at the early poetry again, the Song of Deborah, the Blessing of Moses, and so on, is that Yahweh comes from the south, Mount Paran, the region of Edom. Okay, that's the old poetry. In Sinai, which is probably located there rather than Sinai Peninsula. And so that is, it seems like the early poetry marks that out as Yahweh's origins. He's from Teman, he's from the Southland. But then in later Israelite development, you have what I would understand as cultural amnesia, where that negative memory is forgotten. And so you have the rewrite in Psalm 68, which rewrites I believe the Song of Deborah and the Blessing of Moses, and it's in Yahweh simply comes from the wasteland from Sinai. So Edom becomes an enemy, is simply excised, forgotten. So is that kind of what you mean by negative memories? Where you have, in a sense, cultural amnesia in Israel?
I meant for the whole process of adapting cultural memory from outside and internalizing it as own cultural memory, and then how to deal with it.
I see. Okay, I'll have to think. So if you could point me to those articles by Alida Assmann.